Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies. And this is Comacine Masters from the Encyclopedia of Freemasonry by Albert G. Mackey. Comacine Masters. It has long been a theory of some writers, secular and Masonic, that there was a direct succession of the operative guilds from the Roman colleges to those who merged into Speculative Masonry in 1770, and as investigation proceeded, the proofs became stronger and stronger until now it can no longer reasonably be doubted. At first it was not attempted to prove the succession, it was only inferred, but recently more careful investigations have come to view, whose results go far in establishing the direct succession from Roman colleges to Speculative Masonry. The principal purpose of this article is to put a link in the chain of operative guilds and establish a continuous connection from the oldest guild formation, Roman colleges, which see through the Lombard period and Renaissance to the formation of speculative masonry by the English guilds, before beginning the description of the Comacine Masters, which, from the controversial character of the subject, must of necessity be kindred to a discussion resting heavily on citations and quoted authorities who have worked in this special field. It will be necessary to draw a fair picture of the Roman possessions and civilization at this period, when Rome had passed the zenith of her power and had begun to decline from internal and external causes. It is but natural to suppose that her neighboring enemies noticed this, and as they had long looked upon Italy with avaricious eyes, felt the time had arrived for them to attain what they had most desired. The year 476 AD, when the last of the nominal Caesars ceased to rule in the West, is usually taken by historians as marking the fall of the Roman Empire. However true that may be, the falling began when Constantine established the seat of his empire at Constantinople in 327 and drew much strength from Rome, thereby making it easy for the Vandals and Goths to renew their attacks. For 5 centuries, horde after horde of barbarians flung themselves against the Roman frontiers, each striking deeper than the last, and being repelled with greater and greater difficulty, the empire sinking beneath internal decay more than from her external enemies. When the Western Empire ceased in the 5th century and Europe was plunged into what has been called the Dark Ages, and all progress in letters and the arts is supposed to have ceased, it is refreshing to quote what John Fiske said in Old and New Ways of Treating History when speaking of that period. In truth, the dull ages which no Homer has snug or Tacitus described have sometimes been critical ages for human progress. This restriction of the views to literary ages has had much to do with the popular misconception of the 1,000 years that elapsed between the reign of Theodoric the Great and the discovery of America. For many reasons, that period might be called the Middle Ages. But the popular mind is apt to lump these 10 centuries together as if they were all alike and apply the misleading epithet, Dark Ages. A portion of the darkness is in the minds of those who would use the epithet. I also wish to take exception to their position and conclusions, for in the success of my exceptions lies the potency and possibility of my subject. The Comacine Masters, who lived and built at this period, having descended from branches of the Roman colleges of artificers who had come to Como as colonists or had fled to the Free Republic for safety during barbaric invasions, creating and developing what is called Lombard architecture, and forming a powerful guild which later not only influenced but had a connection with the guilds of France and Germany at the Renaissance, thereby establishing a direct line of descent of Roman colleges to the operative guilds that grew into speculative masonry. It can be understood how a tribe or a small section of people may, from various causes, recede in letters, science, and civilization, but how the world could do so is difficult to comprehend. Yet the historians and literature attempted to confirm this in describing the gloom when the sun of progress was in a total or partial eclipse from the 5th to the 12th centuries, or between the period of ancient classic art of Rome and that early rise of art in the 12th century, which led to the Renaissance. Letter Scott says that this hiatus is supposed to be a time when art was utterly dead and buried, its corpse in Byzantine dress laying embalmed in its tomb at Ravenna. But all death is nothing but the germ of new life. Art was not a corpse. It was only a seed laid in Italian soil to germinate, and it bore several plants before the great reflowering period of the Renaissance. Those who produced these several plants, which it bore before the great cathedral building period that followed the Renaissance, will furnish the subject of this article, and trust it will be as interesting and important to the Masonic student as it is new in the literature of Masonry. Most things will, I trust, become more and more clear as we follow up the traces of the Comacine Guild from the chrysalis state in which Roman art hibernated during the dark winter of the usually called Dark Ages, as Scott says, through the grub state of the Lombard period to the glorious winged flight of the full Gothic of the Renaissance. Many historians, Masonic and profane, who wrote as long as a generation ago, are inclined to give the impression that there was but little or nothing that transpired during the so-called Dark Ages, which was essential to the world's progress at the time, or worthy of contemplation at present. How their views of the importance of historical matter prevailed. We would now know very little of what transpired from the fall of the western part of the Roman Empire to the Renaissance. We know that many cities in Italy were rebuilt after they had been sacked and partly destroyed by the Goths and Huns. Many cathedrals were built during this period, some of which work lasts till today and is worthy workmanship. The historical architects have approached this period from another angle, and the results of their efforts now make this article possible and open up a new and important field for Masonic students. Toward the end of the 5th century, a new wave of barbaric invasion swept over the West. North and East Gaul, all previously held by the Visigoths, fell into the hands of the Franks, 486. Theodoric and the Ostrogoths wrestled Italy from Oder-Acer and established the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, with its capital at Ravenna. This kingdom was established and governed on exceptionally enlightened lines. Theodoric, often called the Great, was the most broad-minded and advanced of all the German conquerors. He was a man of culture, yet some have said that he could not read. He had been educated from his 8th to his 18th year at Constantinople. His rule was, therefore, more like the revival of Roman ideas than a barbarous conquest. Accordingly, we need not be surprised to find him decorating his capital city, Ravenna, during the period of his occupation, 493 through 526, with a series of monuments which, although strongly tinctured with Byzantine influence, yet constitute, perhaps, the first example we possess of the early Christian style. Theodoric was an Arian and opposed to the Bishop of Rome. This fact and his education at Constantinople are sufficient to explain the strong Byzantine elements, so noticeable, even in those monuments at Ravenna, which antedate the Byzantine conquest. Charles A. Cummings, in his History of Architecture in Italy, says, one of the earliest acts of Theodoric after his ascension to the throne was the appointment of an architect to have charge of all public buildings, including the aqueducts and the city walls of Ravenna and Rome, putting at his disposal for this purpose yearly 1,200 pounds of gold, 250,000 bricks, and the income of the Lucrine haven. A remarkable letter from Theodoric to this official on his appointment is preserved by Cassiodorus, who was the minister of the empire. These excellent buildings, he says, are my delight. They are the noble image of the power of the empire, and bear witness of the power to its grandeur and glory. The palace of the sovereign is shown to ambassadors as a monument worthy of their admiration. and seems to declare to them his greatness. It is then a great pleasure for an enlightened prince to inhabit a palace where all the perfections of art are united, and to find there relaxation from the burden of public affairs. I give you notice that your intelligence and talents have determined me to confide to your hands the care of my palace. It is my wish that you preserve in its original splendor all which is ancient, and that whatever you add to it may be conformable to it in style. It is not a work of small importance which I place in your hands, since it will be your duty to fulfill by your art the lively desire which I feel to illustrate my reign by many new edifices, so that whether the matter in hand be the rebuilding of a city, the construction of new castles, or the building of a praetorium, it will be for you to translate my projects into accomplished realities, and that this service, highly honorable and worthy of any man's ambition, to leave to future ages the monuments which shall be the admiration of new generations of men. It will be your duty to direct the mason, the sculptor, the painter, the worker in stone, in bronze, in plaster, in mosaic. What they know not, you will teach them. The difficulties which they find in their work, you will solve for them. But behold what various knowledge you must possess, thus to instruct artificers of so many sorts. But if you can direct their work to a good and satisfactory end, their success will be your eulogy, and will form the most abundant and flattering reward you could desire. From this, it may be seen that an architect of those days was a complete master of the art of building. He was required to be able to construct a building from foundation to roof, and also to be able to decorate it with sculptures and paintings, mosaics and bronzes. This broad education prevailed in all the schools or lodges up to 1335, when the painters succeeded, which was followed by other branches separating themselves into district guilds. It is a well-known fact when the barbarians were sacking and carrying away the riches of many Italian cities, and particularly of Rome, people fled to more secure places for the better protection of their lives and property. Of the various places to which they fled, only one interests us in this article. Como was a free republic, and many fled there for the protection it afforded. Rome had previously colonized many thousands in Como before the Christian era. See Como. The first we hear of the Comacines was that they were living on an island called Isola Comacina in Lake Como, that most beautiful of lakes. They were so well fortified that it was years before the island was captured, and then only by treachery. Their fortifications and buildings were similar to those built by the colleges of artificers at Rome, which gave rise to the belief that they were the direct descendants from these Roman builders, who had built for the Roman Empire for several centuries. In offering the form of building as best evidence of the descent of the Comacines from the Roman colleges, it is appreciated how recorded literature, which is usually the word and opinions of one person, can be biased, changed, and often wrong. But all who have studied a people in their social, political, or religious aspects know how permanent these things are, and how subject to slow changes. Their forms of dress, songs, folklore, and language undergo changes, but slowly. Climate, unsuccessful wars, and amalgamation proving the most disastrous. But probably none of these change so slowly as forms of building, unless the latter be subject to the marked change of climate from migration. Architecture is one of the most noblest and most useful of arts, and one of the first to attract the attention of barbarous people when into a higher civilization, and is at times an accurate measure of a people's standing in civilization. A law we learn from biology in the morphology of animals is that nature never makes a new organ when she can modify an old one so as to perform the required functions. Now, styles of architecture do not spring from human intellect as creations. Cattaneo says, monuments left by a people are truer than documents, which often prove fallacious and misleading and prove no profit for those who blindly follow them. The story of a people or a nation if not known by writing, might be guessed through its monuments and works of art. The Lombards, who had come from northern Germany and settled in northern Italy in 568, at once began to develop along many lines which made Lombardy known all over Europe, the result of which influence Europe feels today. They developed along lines which in our everyday parlance may be called business. They were not primarily architects or builders, and they employed the Comacines for this kind of work. And it was the Comacines who developed what is known today as Lombard architecture, covering a period that we might roughly put as from the 7th century to the Renaissance. To draw attention to the name, Magistri Comacini was the erudite Moritore, that searcher out of ancient manuscripts who unearthed from the archives an edict dated November 22, 643, signed by Rothorus, in which are included 2 clauses treating of the Magistri Comacini and their colleagues. The 2 clauses, 143 and 144, out of the 388 inscribed in cribbed Latin, says letter Scott are anglicized to the following intent. Art 143 of the Magister Comacinus. If the Comacine Master with his colleagues shall ever contract to restore or build a house of any person whatsoever, the contract for payment being made, and it chances that someone shall die by the fall of the said house, or any material or stone from it, the owner of said house shall not be cited by the Master Comacinus or his brethren to compensate them for homicide or injury, because having for their own gain contracted for the payment of the building, they just sustain the risk and injuries thereof. Art 144. On the engaging and hiring a magistrate. If any person was engaged or hired one or more Comacine Masters to design a work or to daily assist his workmen in building a palace or a house, and it shall happen by reason of the house, some Comacine shall be killed. The owner of the house is not considered responsible, but if a pole or stone shall injure some extraneous person, the master builder shall not bear the blame, but the person who hired him shall make compensation. Charles A. Cummings says, the Code of Liutprand, 80 years later, contains further provisions regulating the practice of Comacina, which had now become much more numerous and important. Fixed rates of payment were established for their services, varying according to the kind of building on which they were engaged. Definite prices being allowed for walls of various thickness, for arches and vaults, for chimneys, plastering, and joiners' work. The difficulty which these early builders found in the construction of vaults is indicated by the allowance of a charge per superficial foot, from 15 to 18 times as great as in the case of a wall. The price of provisions and wine furnished to the workmen is also determined and is counted as part of their pay. Scott maintains that these laws prove that in the 7th century, the Magistri Comacina were a compact and powerful guild, capable of asserting their rights, and that the guild was properly organized, having degrees of different ranks, that the higher orders were entitled magistri, and could design or undertake a work, i.e., act as architects, and the collegantes or colleagues worked under or with them. In fact, a powerful organization altogether, so powerful and so solid that it spoke of a very ancient foundation. Was it the surviving branch of the Roman Collegium, or a descendant group of Byzantine artists stranded in Italy? Professor Mazzario says, in this darkness which extended all over Italy, only one small lamp remained alight, making a bright spark in the vast Italian metropolis. It was from the Magistri Comacina. Their respective names are unknown, their individual work unspecialized, but the breath of their spirit might be felt all through those centuries, and their names collectively is legion. We may safely say that of all the workers of art between AD 800 and 1000, the greater and better part are due to that brotherhood, always faithful and often secret, of the Magistri Comacina. The authority and judgment of learned men justify the assertion. Courtenay de Quincy, in his Dictionary of Architecture, under the heading Comacines, remarks that to these men who were both designers and executors, architects, sculptors, and mosaicists, may be attributed the Renaissance of art and its promulgation in the southern countries where it marched with Christianity. Certain it is that we owe to them that the heritage of antique ages was not entirely lost, and it is only by their tradition and imitation that the art of building was kept alive, producing works which we still admire and which become surprising when we think of the utter ignorance of all science in those dark ages. Hope, in his well-balanced style, draws quite a picture of the guilds at this period, which upon the whole is fairly accurate. He says, when Rome, the eternal city, was first abandoned for Milan, Ravenna, and other cities in the more fertile north, which became seats of new courts and the capitals of new kingdoms, we find in northern Italy a rude and barbarous nation, the Lombards, in the space of 2 short centuries, producing in trade, in legislation, in finance, in industry of every description, new developments so great that from them and from the regions to which they attach their names has issued the whole of that ingenious and complex systems of bills of exchange, bank, insurance, double entry bookkeeping, commercial and marine laws, and public loans, since adopted all over Europe, retaining in their peculiar applications the trace and landmarks of their origin, and all over Europe affording to capital and commerce an ease of captivity and a security unknown before. To keep the peace with this progress, kings, lesser lords, and the municipalities that by some degrees arose were induced, at one time from motives of public policy, at other times of private advantage, to encourage artificers of different professions. Thus, of their own accord, they granted licenses to form associations possessed of the exclusive privilege of exercising their peculiar trades, and making them an object of profit, of requiring that use, anxious to be associated with their body, and ultimately to be endowed with the mastery of the profession, should submit to a fixed and often severe course of study, under the name of apprenticeship for their master's profit, and in addition should frequently be compelled to pay a considerable premium, and of preventing any individual not thus admitted into their body from establishing a competition against them. These associations were called corporations or guilds. These bodies, in order to enjoy exclusive exercise of their profession, and that its profits should be secured to them not only by law, but by the inability of others to violate it, by degrees made their business or craft, as they called it, a profound mystery from the world at large, and only suffered their own apprentices to be initiated in its higher branches and improvements. Most gradually, and in every place where a variety of paths of industry and art was struck out, these crafts, these corporations, these masterships and their mysteries became so universally prevalent that not only the arts of a wholly mechanical nature, but even those of the most exalted and intellectual nature, those which in ancient times had been considered the exclusive privilege of freemen and citizens, and those dignified with the name liberal, were submitted to all those narrow rules of corporations and connected with all the servile offices of apprenticeship, while Hope and writers of his time recognized that some well-organized body of workers had dominated the building trades at the Lombard period of history. They never attempted to trace their genealogy. Later historical critics of architecture have given some attention to the origin and succession of these building crafts. One of the latest Italian students, Riveri, has devoted a separate chapter to the Comacine Masters, as his extensive work on Lombard architecture, its origin, development, and derivatives may be accessible to but few. I shall give a generous quotation from him for the importance of his sound conclusions. The origin of the Comacine Masters in the Diocese of Como is explained quite naturally, according to D. d'Artagnan, Mazzario, and others, by the custom, which has always existed among the craftsmen and workmen of that region, of leaving their native places in order to betake themselves in gangs wherever building works are about to be or have been begun, urged thereto by their barren mountain soul, pecuniary gain, their innate ability and enterprising character. Another explanation is to be found in the presence of the shores of the lakes of Como, Lugano, and the Maggiore, of numerous stones, marble, and timber yards, which furnished building material for the cities of the plains. These yards gave scope for the practice of the crafts of carver, carpenter, builder, etc., and these in their turn, by constant practice and continuous progress, ultimately developed architects and sculptors. And here we may naturally feel surprise at the appearance, amid the darkest of the early centuries of the Middle Ages, of a corporation of craftsmen who, though of Roman origin, nonetheless enjoyed Lombard citizenship and the rights belonging to it, while the Roman or Italian subjects of Lombard rule were, if not slaves, nothing better than audi, that is to say, midway between freedmen and serfs, manumitted on the condition of performing the manual task assigned to them by the manumittor. A corporation, too, which had a legal monopoly of public and private building work within the territories occupied by the Lombards, as the Code of the Rotharies proves, and can claim the honor of filling up the gap which for so long was believed, especially by non-Italian writers, to exist between the incorporated artisans of the Roman epoch, supposed to have vanished with the fall of the empire, and the guilds of craftsmen which sprang up so luxuriantly in the 13th and 14th centuries. Such surprise, however, may easily be allayed if we consider that in reality the fraternity of craftsmen, in Italy at least, by no means came to an end with the barbarian invasions, and particularly that of the Lombards, who actually preserved these Roman institutions which best fulfilled their aim of keeping the conquered people in subjection. Accordingly, they would have maintained the corporation of artisans in order to make the exaction of tribute easier, and at the same time to be able to keep a hold over the individuals composing them. Hence we have good grounds for inferring that the corporation of Comacine, who apparently were neither more nor less than the successors of the master masons who in the days of the empire had directed the operations of the collegia, especially devoted to building, survived the barbarian invasions which were so disastrous to Italy in the centuries preceding the ascension of Rotharies to the Lombard throne. This view is confirmed by the undoubted fact that from this time onwards the Comacine formed a very important guild, as is shown by the need which he felt of making regulations for it in his laws. This guild could not have sprung into existence full grown and, as it were, by magic, just when the Code of the Rotharies made its appearance in 643. It must have already been in existence and have attained some degree of importance well before Alboin's descent on Italy, 568. Troya, in fact, remarks that when the Lombards of the time of Altorius, 583 through 590, and of Augilov and Theodolinda, 590 through 625, wanted to erect buildings, they must have made use of it. And everything leads one to think that before the promulgation of the Code of Rotharies, some of the members, i.e., those of the highest capacity and reputation, had already been enfranchised by, impans, or express grace of the king. However that may be, the mention of the association of the Comacini in the region of Rotharies and the Yukon is one of the earliest in the barbarian world, and earlier than that of any guild of architects or builders among the Middle Ages. Whatever may have been the organization of the Comacine or Lombard guilds, and however these may have been affected by outward events, they did not cease to exist in consequence of the fall of the Lombard kingdom, with the first breath of municipal freedom, and with the rise of the new brotherhoods of artisans. They too, perhaps, may have reformed themselves like the latter, who were nothing but the continuation of the collegium of Roman times, preserving its existence through the barbarian ages and transformed little by little into the medieval corporation. The members may have found themselves constrained to enter into a more perfect unity of thought and sentiment, to bind themselves into a more compact body and thus themselves in a condition to maintain their ancient supremacy and carrying out the most important building works in Italy. But we cannot say anything more. And even putting aside all tradition, the monuments themselves are there to confirm what we have said. Finally, towards the 11th century, the Comacine brotherhoods began to relax their bonds of union to make room gradually for personality and for artistic and scientific individuality, till at length they vanished at the close of the 15th century with the disappearance of the Lombardic style which they had created and the rise of the architecture of the Renaissance. Letter Scott has reasonably inferred 1. That the architects of the same guild worked at Rome and in Ravenna in the early centuries after Christ. 2. That though the architects were Roman, the decorations up to the 4th century were chiefly Byzantine, or had imbibed that style as their paintings show. 3. That in the time when Rome laid in a heap of ruins under the barbarians, the Collegium or a Collegium, I know not which, led to independent Como, and there in after centuries they were employed by the Lombards and ended in again becoming a powerful guild. There was the greatest similarity in form of the cathedrals of this period, and when changes were introduced, they became general, thereby creating a unity of purpose and an interchange of ideals, which spoke the existence of some kind of guild or fraternity with a perfected organization. That the Comacines received ideals which somewhat influenced their building art is probably true, particularly their decorations. On the latter question, Muller in the following work says, "From Constantinople as a center of mechanical skill, a knowledge of art, radiated to distant countries, and corporations of builders of Grecian birth were permitted to exercise a judicial government among themselves, according to the laws of the country to which they owed allegiance." This was the age when more symbolism was made use of than at any other period. The reason being that the Christian religion, having so lately supplanted paganism, and as most converts could not read, the Bible was spread only in the front of the cathedrals in the form of sculpted saints, animals, and symbolic figures. Hope says, "Pictures can always be read by all people, and when symbolic uses are made, and once explained, will be ever after understood." The eastern branch of the church at Constantinople prohibited imagery and other forms of adoration of their churches, and like disputants, when one denies, the other affirms. The western branch of Rome espoused the carvings of images and beautiful sculpture. This caused the eastern sculptors to come to Italy, where they were welcomed by the Roman branch of the church. That policy of the Rome branch was carried throughout the cathedral building period that followed in Europe for several centuries, and to this day is a dominant element with them, for they still believe that to properly spread their religion, noble architecture, fine sculpting and painting, and inspiring music are prime requisites. We speculative Masons should give full credit to the Roman Catholic Church for employing and fostering our operative brethren through many centuries and making possible speculative Freemasonry of today, even though the Church is now our avowed enemy. Combining some arguments that have been reasonably put forward for the maintenance of this theory, and adding others, it may be pointed out that the individual form of lodges in different cities is a strong argument that the same ruling body governed them all. An argument equally strong is the ubiquity of the members. We find the same men employed in one lodge after another, as work required. Not only were these charges or migrations from one cathedral to another accomplished in Italy, but we have many examples of masters and special workmen going into France, Germany, and other countries. Unfortunately, no documents exist of the early Lombard times, but the archives of the opera, which in most cities have been faithfully kept since the 13th century, would, if thoroughly examined, prove to be valuable stores from which to draw a history of the Masonic Guild. They have only begun to examine carefully these records, and when completed, we may reasonably expect to learn much concerning this period. Letter Scott examines several and gives continuous lists of masters of the school or lodge in different cities. In C&E's school, a list of 67 masters in continuous succession from 1259 to 1423. At Florence Lodge, 78 Masters from 1258 to 1418. At Milan Lodge, 79 Masters from 1387 to 1647. She, for Leonard Scott, was a woman whose real name was Mrs. Lucky Baxter, gives headings of laws for these lodges, and it may be interesting to glance over the headings of statutes of these Masonic guilds, which will throw light on all the organizations. The Sienese Guild is a typical one and will serve our purpose. There are 41 chapters, but the headings of only 12 will be selected. C1, one who curses God or the saints, a fine of 25 lira. C2, one who opposes the Senora of City, a fine of 25 lira. C5, how to treat underlings, sottoposti or apprentices. C11, that no one take work from another master. C13, how the feast of the 4 holy martyrs is to be kept. Feast of the Dead, November. 2 half-pound candles and offering. Grand fete of the guild in June. C16, the Camerlingo shall hand all receipts to Grand Master. C19, one who is sworn to another guild cannot be either Grand Master or Camerlingo. C22, how members are to be buried. C23, how to insure against risk. C24, no argument or business discussion to be held in public streets. C30, that no master shall undertake a second work till the first has been paid. C34, on those who lie against others. These statutes are very fair and well composed and must certainly have been made from long experience in the guild. The genealogy of these styles of architecture has baffled many. Leonard Scott believes this to be the line of descent. First, the Comacines continued Roman traditions, as the Romans continued Etruscan ones. Next, they orientalized their style by their connection with the East, through Aquileia and the influx of the Greek exiles into the guild. Later came a different influence, through the Saracens into the South, and the Italian Gothic was born. In the old times, 6th to the 10th centuries, before the painters and sculptors, and after them, the metalworkers, split off and formed companies of their own. Every kind of decoration was practiced by the masters, as the letter of Theodoric plainly shows. A church was not complete unless it was adorned, in its whole height and breadth, with sculpture on the outside, mosaics or paintings on the inside, and in its completeness formed the people's Bible and dogma of religious belief. And this from the very early times of Constantine and his Byzantine mosaicist, and of Queen Theolinda and her fresco painters, up to the revival of the mosaics by the Cosmati and the Friscan painting in the Tuscan schools, but never were these arts entirely lost. For the first, we have the identity of form and ornamentation in their works, and the similarity of nomenclature and organization between the Roman Collegio and the Lombard Guild of Magister. Besides this, the well-known fact that the Free Republic of Como was used as a refuge by Romans who fled from barbaric invasions made a strong argument. For the second, we may plead again the same identity of form and organization and a like similar ornamentation and nomenclature. Just as King Leopold's architects were called magistri, and the Grand Master the Gattaldo, so we have the great architectural guilds in Venice in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, using the very same titles and having the very same laws. Again, the hereditary descent is marked by the patron saints of the Lombard and Tuscan lodges, being the 4 martyr brethren from a Roman collegio. See 4 crowned martyrs. All these and other indications are surely as strong as documental proof, and are practically the summary of the conclusions of Leonard Scott, and are not overdrawn, being amply bore out by facts already known. Older writers recognized the presence of a compact guild in the work, but did not connect them with the builders of the Renaissance. More recent writers, such as Riboya, Porter, and others declare the connection. This connection is probably without the field of historical architects, whose work is the study of the product of the workmen, and not the workmen themselves, while our interest is centered on the workmen and their relations to those who follow them in connected sequence, and not on the product of their work, further than to show improved relationships of the building crafts. There are many more interesting and important things pertaining to the Comacines that must be omitted in a cyclopedic article. Their rich, varied, and curious symbolism, which even Ruskin failed to understand, would furnish material for a fair-sized volume. While it is recognized that history should always be written from as nearly original sources as is possible, it has not been realized in this instance, as I have had to rely solely on those who have made their investigations at first hand. And while some liberties have been taken, no violence has been done to their conclusions. The reader will find a rich field in the following bibliography: The Cathedral Builders, the story of a great Masonic guild by Leader Scott. The Comacines, their predecessors and their successors by W. Ravencroft. Lombard Architecture, its origin, development, and derivatives by G.T. Riboya. A History of Architecture in Italy from the time of Constantine to the dawn of the Renaissance by Charles A. Cummings. Medieval Architecture by A.K. Porter. Architecture in Italy from the 6th to the 11th century. Historical and Critical Researches by Raffaele Cattaneo. Historical Essay on Architecture by Thomas Hope. These are English works or have been translated into English. From them, an extensive bibliography embracing other languages will be found. EEC. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.